Everybody to this session. For those of you who were tuned in or attended the opening keynote where Johan and Wayne came and making their opening remarks, they talked about how the key theme of the show was around improving or decreasing the TCO of IoT projects, and that's what we're going to be talking about today during this session. So specifically, let's break down the complete TCO of an IoT project. I am joined, gentlemen, welcome. I'm joined by Nick Gyles, who is here from Daizy. Nick, if you could introduce yourself, say a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so hi, Nick Gyles, Chief Products Officer at Daizy. Daizy is a tool set for service management for IoT, so helping organizations scale everything across the life cycle, from designing the project, installing devices, field service, in-life monitoring, and then making sure that the data that's coming from these sensors is contextualized and delivered to an application. So making it possible to do that at massive scale requires quite a few tooling aspects, and that's what Daizy brings.
Excellent. Roelof Koopmans, who is from Dracula Technologies. Roelof,
yeah, thank you.
Introduce yourself a little.
Yeah, so I'm VP of Business Development for a company called Dracula Technologies, which is specialized in creating energy harvesting modules for electronic devices, specifically low power electronic devices. And these energy harvesting modules can work on ambient light, specifically very low ambient light, hence the name Dracula, that we operate very well in the dark. And this is for many use cases like smart building. That's a game changer, just to get rid of the batteries, which drive up the operational cost for a long-term deployment of smart building sensors.
Excellent. And last but not least, Dane Ralston of iOpt. Dane?
Hi, Matt. So I'm Dane Ralston, CEO of iOpt, Internet of Property things that stands for, but we very much specialize in social housing or public housing. So basically giving the landlords who operate social housing properties better insight into how their properties are being used, how they're performing, and how they're being maintained. So we see the full life cycle from literally just buying the sensors all the way through to disposal of them at the end of it.
Excellent. If I can stay with you, Dane, the first question is really, what are the key cost items that you need to take into account when you're considering the TCO of an IoT project?
Oh, that's a pretty wide
question.
Well,
it is indeed.
Well, we sort of look at it as it's not necessarily the most important part, is the total cost of the ownership of the system. It's actually the value that you get out of it. So there's the fairly obvious things of buying the sensors, getting the data back, and then running the platform. But actually, one of the bigger items that we've seen, and we are a data supplier, so one of the things that we didn't quite appreciate was actually the installation of putting sensors into homes. And particularly in social housing, we have a fairly low, what we would call a hit rate of access into properties. So at the minute, we are only getting a 50% access rate. So building that into your total cost of ownership is very, very important. And something that Roelof will talk about is the battery life as well. So access to a property in social housing in particular is one of the main reasons why we exist, because our customers have properties they haven't been inside in 15 years. So being able to get back in to change something like the battery in it is really something you can't allow for. So we have to build sensors with longer battery life or that can energy harvest. So there's really a very large number of different aspects you need to build into your total cost of ownership.
Okay, and Roelof, what do you think about when you think about the elements that constitute a TCO of an IoT project?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I mean, most of the project gets started on the cost of the hardware. So you talk about sensors and gateways, a bit of cabling, and then you get a piece of software on top, and then in network operation costs, either you invest in your own LoRaWAN private network, or you do it as an OpEx, where you basically buy from a LoRaWAN operator, right? So that's like the typically CapEx, how a project is reviewed. I tend to say that's only half of the cost. You have to look at the operational cost for the lifetime of the project. So if you take like a 10-year lifetime, you have to think about, okay, what does it take in terms of project managing the implementation, onboarding the users, onboarding the sensors, and maintaining the batteries, right, during the lifetime. So there's more operational cost coming to a first CapEx analysis of an IT solution. So And that sort of insights come usually later after they've done a first pilot. They haven't taken it into account in a very early stage. I can only recommend, do that early enough before you try to get your ROI and your business case approved.
And Nick, I should let you join in there. And actually, I'm particularly interested in how easy it is to assess that TCO over the what it's likely to be over the life of the device. So, what are the elements, and how easy is it to assess them?
I think the key thing that makes or breaks the return on investment and that drives the cost in the project is the number of times you visit that sensor. So making sure that at the point of installation, whoever is installing that device, it is communicating, it's sending the data you expect it to, it's connected up in the right way, but also that it's configured correctly. Because if the device hasn't been configured for an appropriate power strategy, then that's going to impact how, if you're not doing energy harvesting, how soon you have to go back to replace the batteries. If you've not got enough gateways, then is the device on a spreading factor, which means it's going to chew through the battery, an order of magnitude quicker than if it's on spreading factor 7. So, getting that installation absolutely right so that you don't have to go and revisit. Because to Dane's point, quite often just access to sensors is really tricky. You might struggle to get in to install it, but once it's installed, getting back to then doing something about it in the future can be a really costly and highly process-driven event.
And how likely is it, therefore, that you're actually going to be able to accurately tell what the likely TCO is of a project during the initial trial phase or test phase? Because there's this complexity in the real world deployment. Dane talked to it about the getting access to the premises. Can you even factor that in? Do you know how to factor that in? Is that even possible? Nick, I'll stick with you.
I think what we've seen in pilots, the TCO in a pilot is always very different to the TCO at scale. So I think the answer is it's really difficult to get all of those aspects. So human error, for example, in a pilot, it's possible to manage these things on a spreadsheet. Which device CUI have I put into attached to which asset or which location, and then just plumb that into your application. But as soon as you go to scale and you're into moves and changes in the projects, a sensor dies, therefore somebody takes another one out of the van and sticks it on the wall, and can your application adapt to that? A lot of those costs are really kind of buried until that becomes a significant cost of change. So I think the simple answer is whatever you're doing at a pilot is going to cost you double when you do it at scale.
Does that resonate with you, Roelof, as well?
It does. I think we've seen customers like in logistics. I speak now like in a broader IoT perspective, not just from energy harvesting, but larger cargo companies, transport companies. If they're trying out a battery-based tracking solution, for example, on wagons or cargo trailers, just to schedule the access to those assets is a huge cost. It's a factor more than the sensor cost, right? So you buy a sensor of $100, but you can calculate probably $200 to replace the sensor or the battery. So that's an even more challenging scenario than smart buildings, where either ceiling-mounted sensors, wall-mounted sensors are relatively okay to access. The problem is people don't know where the sensors are. So in terms of managing the battery replacement, there is no system usually for doing it. There's no process for doing it. So we recommend our customers to do this kind of assumptions and metrics like, okay, how much time does it take? Put a ladder, take off the sensor, get the battery out. It could be 10 minutes for one sensor, right? So, and then the labor cost starts adding up for thousands of sensors.
Yeah, and does that apply with you as well, Dane? Can you accurately make assumptions about, you mentioned that the big issue was access to properties. How accurately can you estimate what that's going to be? Because if you're trying to calculate the TCO of a project, you kind of have to do that, right? And can you do it accurately?
Yeah, no, not massively. We've always gone on with the assumption that we know that we can break even on a project for our customers, and that's what we tell them. They're so complex that we've got a number of different use cases. So it might be mold growth, or it might be preventative maintenance. We know that we can cover the costs or wash the face of the project on that alone, but we always say there will be other use cases, and we're getting a better handle on it because the whole thing is relatively new. We're still learning what the different use cases are that will then build up the ROI that will help build the whole thing out. But it comes back to the whole robustness of the rollout. So not just the sensors and getting them to connect as such, but that comes back to then the app that you've got to help do that. So we use the Daizy app for doing our installations, and it's really robust. It won't be perfect because we'll always be iterating, and I think that's what most people need to understand. We're still all iterating in the different ways of whether it's the application or the business case, or even just understanding the network coverage. If you don't have decent network coverage, then you're going to get access somewhere, and it might look decent coverage outside, but inside. So trying to plan and learn from each deployment is key to how do we get it to work at scale.
Yeah. My next question was about hidden costs, but it seems like pretty much everything we've been talking about there is to some extent a hidden cost, right? Is there anything else that people may not be thinking about when they're thinking about the TCO of their IoT projects?
I would highlight gateways. There's two strategies, and early on in a project, you probably want to decide, are you installing your own gateways, or are you using a network operator? In the UK, we have a few different LoRaWAN providers. I know it's the same in other European markets. So, and to some extent, choosing a network operator means that you are fixing that cost. So, it's not going to come and be a hidden problem in the future. That you can guarantee that they're providing that network connectivity to some SLA. As long as it's covering the areas you need it to. But it's probably going to end up being more complex if you're installing your own gateways where you've got the SIM backhaul, or making sure that the gateway stays connected. That can be quite a complex issue to have to manage on an ongoing basis.
Got it. And Roelof, Dane, any other hidden costs?
I'd like to point out that for battery-based devices, people underestimate the amount of labor cost that goes into replacing the batteries over the lifetime. So if you have like a 10-year lifetime and you have to replace them 3-4 times, every sort of labor interaction could be $10, $20, $30, depending on where the asset is. So you add up like close to $100 over the lifetime of the asset. That cost goes forgotten. And we've done several TCO analysis, and you can cut your TCO by 30 or 40% for the lifetime of 10 years if you just eliminate the batteries.
Yeah.
I think to me, it's probably the mantra would be buy cheap, buy twice.
Yep.
And that can be whether you're talking about network coverage or having a big enough battery or going for the sort of energy scavenging. But yeah, that would be the biggest thing that we've seen. And we set out to be a data provider, not building networks, and we've now all of a sudden got 600 gateways in the field. We still don't want to be doing that, but it's those little things that all add up, particularly as a solutions provider.
Okay, so we've got a stack of different elements that constitute the TCO. I think we've done a pretty good job of identifying what they are. If you're a company that's deploying IoT, what kind of best practices and tools can you use in terms of accurately modeling that TCO of the project? Can you even hope to do it? Dane, I'll stick with you on the end there.
That's a good question. Probably try and work with somebody who's done it before is the absolute key to it. There are so many different costs to a project. How do you model what the costs are? There's, again, the very obvious ones. I'm not really sure I can answer that one, to be honest. That's a
fair. Roelof, I think you probably do you've done some work on TCO tools, right?
Yeah, we actually have been able to model this with several customers, because we believe the energy harvesting adoption will be driven more by the TCO than by the sustainability. We all talk about sustainability, at the end of the day we talk about dollars. So TCO is the main driver for adoption of energy harvesting, and we did several case analysis with customers deploying on a large scale, globally, hundreds of buildings. And there's a good way to do it such that you really sort of simulate the efforts of doing these processes, right? So you have to sort of monitor people doing a battery swap, how much time does it take, calculate the business case. So you can get very close to a good estimate, and it will be mind-boggling for many people once they do the number crunching.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. Nick?
I would say a number of sensor manufacturers do have really good modeling tools for simulating, battery life based on your uplink strategy, your data sampling strategy. So, go with vendors that you're seeing that they've done that homework in terms of being able to predict battery life. But also, we're seeing devices where the simplest solution sometimes in terms of battery replacement is actually to rip the device out and replace it with a new one. And then when you get back to the headquarters, take the device apart to replace the batteries, just because they're quite, fiddly to get in. If you're in somebody's house, you don't necessarily want to be taking devices apart with a screwdriver to change batteries. And some costs associated with that, associated with kind of the reverse logistics, but also the moves and changes in your application, making sure that your application can cope with the fact that now that data point is coming from a new device, a new sensor ID, and understanding what that cost of change is within your app as well as the wider deployment.
Dane, you talked about adding in additional new services, I think, in one of your opening comments about, okay, well, when you go in and install a device, maybe you're not aware of every app that it's going to be supporting over the course of the lifespan. So how do those ROI calculations or TCO calculations change over time? How do you factor in things to do with how the deployment might evolve as it evolves?
Yeah, well, so sort of going back to one of your questions of the hidden cost features into this, is working very closely with our customers and so we go in and we've got a very good understanding, for example, of what kind of savings we can realize through mold and damp or through temporary accommodation monitoring, things like that. The one thing that our customers, and we're very keen to point out to them, that they need to engage with us. We don't have all the answers. They need to come and talk to us. And that's how we evolve the ROI off the back of it, is working very closely with them. And they don't quite always understand that they need to commit to this. In some cases, they've committed to spending 100,000 or 150,000 pounds on a pilot project. But they just see that as the hardware and the network and stuff like that. But their time as well is the most important thing. If you're going to spend 150,000 pounds on a pilot project, you need to commit some resources to that and build the ROI case. Because fundamentally, if they've committed to spending that kind of money, they've committed in their heads to, this is something that's really worthwhile doing. So let's put more effort into that. And that's probably the biggest one.
Yeah, interesting. Roelof, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think I'd like to add to that is that many IoT projects start with a pilot, which is more like a proof of technology for the use case rather than a proof of value.
Yeah.
The proof of value will give you the ROI necessary data that feeds the whole business case, right? So you have to sort of mirror the real processes that you want to support with IoT technology. So the real processes in real time, and then basically do the metrics on what do you see in terms of improvements, efficiency and effectiveness, and that will feed the business case, else you don't have a real grip around your TCO.
Yeah, you're nodding, Nick?
Yeah, I would say in terms of that ROI for future use cases, I've never seen a project signed off on anything beyond the first use case. If the juice isn't worth the squeeze on that first use case that you're deploying, the CFO is never going to sign it off anyway. So make sure that it stands on its own 2 feet. But what I would say about subsequent use cases is make sure the data isn't siloed so that you can't then access it for some other future use case, whether that's as we're seeing in damper mold now, taking that data and getting into more sort of energy management and energy performance information out of the same temperature humidity data that iOpt is already installing into that property. Really valuable use cases, but you have to make sure that the data isn't siloed into one application and not accessible elsewhere.
Yeah.
A lot of it will also depend on how successful you are, won't it? Because it's a scale question. You've got certain fixed costs. Well, then mostly it's variable costs, I guess. So to what extent does it depend on, if you sell 1 million devices versus you sell 100,000 devices? Does it have that much impact on TCO? Dane,
I didn't quite catch the question.
I said a lot of it will depend on scale, the extent to which you're successful in selling devices, selling solutions, won't it, or will it?
No, not really. I think as long as you're getting the value from it. We always say that they can spend £5,000 per device, but if they're getting £15,000, £20,000 worth of value back on it, then it's fine. So that's where we always talk about it being the total value ownership rather than the total TCO. I had a really good one there.
May I add there, because I tend to disagree. Size does matter in this case. If you have like a corporate enterprise solution where you maybe have 5 sensors on a building, it's a complete different thing if you have 5,000 sensors on one building. You need much more processes and overhead and project management to deal with those 5,000 sensors. So actually there is a scale factor that plays into your TCO calculation.
But you'll probably have a pretty good idea of that when you're going through the trial and test phase, won't you, or will you?
If you do it at scale, yes. If you do it only a small subset, you will never get a flavor for what will be the large scale cost.
Yeah, okay, good. Are you finding that companies holding back on deployments because they can't make the ROI stack up? Is that a pretty common thing that you see with companies that you work with?
Yeah, we were working with a company who had an internal project to roll out temperature humidity sensors, and they deployed the first sort of 2,000 sensors, and it just wasn't working commercially for them in terms of their ability to deploy at scale and derive the value within their own business. And there were two things we did when they came to us with the problem. First of all, was they were trying to manage everything on a spreadsheet, so systemize everything, make sure you know exactly where each sensor is, and that all of the data is contextualized. That was the first part, so just straightening out the project. The second thing was actually bringing it through with iOpt, is that you bringing best-in-class applications to it. So you don't always have to build everything yourself, and to that sort of build or buy decision, others have built the technology already, so make use of it. So by bringing in iOpt, we were able to deliver the end outcome in a much more cost-effective way than the customer having to build it internally themselves.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that? Are you seeing people not deploying because they've done the calculations on ROI and decided that it doesn't make much sense?
We've not seen that so much. It's more the people don't want to change. It's not invented here. I think there was a session in here earlier on about something along those lines. And we've had a conversation today, actually, just before I came on here, where somebody said to me, well, the CFO says it stacks up and that's all that matters. I'm like, absolutely no way is that the case, because if the housing management team are not behind it, for whatever reason, and very rarely is it the financials don't stack up, then it won't happen. It's as simple as that. You've got to get buy-in from everybody on it. So yes, the ROI is the main thing, the factual thing, but there's a whole emotional thing behind it as well, unfortunately.
Which is interesting, because based on that, the friction is between the consideration of between the availability of projects to do and the actual consideration of doing it, and then the running of pilots and the calculation of TCO. Actually, there's maybe less friction in that step of the process. Is that how you see it? Because people talk about 80% of IoT POCs fail. So that would indicate that the majority of it actually is failing at the POC phase, but that doesn't seem to be your experience, or am I kind of putting words in your mouth?
It's not the proof of concept phase, if you're talking about the technology, absolutely not, and it's probably not the ROI phase in most cases, it's the people phase. That's what I was saying earlier on about you've got to get the whole organization bought into it, because one person can make it stop.
Yeah, I can always say from what I've seen that many good POCs actually didn't end up in a full-scale deployment because the way they made the case to their management was not a complete approach where you really have a professional ROI analysis.
Yeah.
So don't underestimate it. If you go to your management for a $1 million+ investment, it got to be good, right? So your whole proof of value with the metrics, efficiency and effectiveness has to sort of stand on its own feet, and then you go to your management and get approval.
And that's before you even consider the changing internal processes that you need to adapt to reflect making use of the IoT data. We're at the end of our time. Gentlemen, thank you. Round of applause for the panel. Thank you.